Hangzhou is to host the G20 summit. Is the city and is the country ready?
We are more than ready. So from food to transportation to the security and for gender, and with the volunteers ready, with the foreign language ready, with cheer band ready. So, what not?
What is not? Everything is ready except the content. Let's talk about the content, which is the most important thing, why there should be a summit. Mr. Kennedy, previous G20 summits, some believe it has been an important international governance platform, while others say it is mainly a talk shop. Which one would you subscribe to?
I'd say it's an important talk shop. Not a talk shop is incredibly important, even if they're not making critical decisions that they're going to implement right away. But there's a lot of issues related to growth of the global economy, trade, investment, the financial architecture for the world that's a little bit rickety and needs some fine-tuning that need to be addressed. And the G20 is one of the best forums that brings together wealthy and developing countries together to talk about those issues and collaborate with other international organizations, bilateral agreements, unilateral steps that will be taken. So it's a part of the overall global governance infrastructure that is critical to addressing issues, even if it doesn't itself make the critical decisions and implement things right away.
Okay. Even though you say it is extremely important, a talk shop, however, we have seen over the past few years some soul searching among some of the other host countries of G20. For example, Australia, for example, Turkey over the past 2 years. They say it's wonderful that they hosted the event, and yet they also regretted it that nothing really concrete and fundamental have come out of those summits. So let me go to you, Mr. Cleppe. Do you think we have really more things to work on? Especially now, China invited more developing economy than it ever been on any G20 summit. This time, even more members, Chad, Laos, Senegal, Egypt, Kazakhstan, together with some of the other already existing developing and emerging economies among G20. So do you think more developing emerging economies is likely to solve the problem, or there's likely to be a bigger fight between this camp and the developed economies, that camp?
It's probably not a bad idea to also involve some countries on invitation in order to discuss specific challenges with them. But one particular issue which definitely will be discussed, is being discussed at the G20, is of course the currency issue. The concern, especially coming from the United States, that China's currency would not be sufficiently strong, that it is artificially suppressed. Of course, many people in the West say that the United States is doing the same, that we're having some kind of a currency war ongoing, to put it a bit in inflated terms. But of course, at the end of the day, probably what China needs to do is to allow some of the financial bubbles that have been erupting as a result of excessive artificial stimulus to unwind.
Well, Mr. Cleppe,
so China can have more balanced growth.
Well, it's wonderful that you're already giving us analysis of the Chinese economy, and yet coming from Europe, you almost forget there is one of the biggest uncertainty in the world, that is the Brexit, and what's likely to happen between the UK and also the EU. So what do you make of what's happening in your home turf? And also, how likely do you think the G20 economies, including many coming from Europe and the others, likely to deal with that? After all, by the way, sir, the finance ministers and also the central governor conference earlier about the G20 was exactly talking about that.
Well, I would not describe Brexit as the first challenge of Europe, only the second. I think the first is the banking crisis in the Eurozone. If you look actually what happened after the Brexit vote, especially Italian bank stocks suffered much more severe than UK stocks. which actually haven't been doing all that bad since the Brexit. So I think there's an understanding in Europe that they will work it out. The stakes are just far too high. The UK will leave at some point in the future, but many people realize that this can take 5, 6, 7, 8 years, maybe 10. And at that point of time, Britain will likely enter a new status, which will be very similar to its current status.
Well, Mr. Cleppe has already responded to my call to do some self-criticism about his own continent. It is also viable, Professor Liu, that you can do some self-criticism or self-assessment of the Chinese economy. Before you do that, we all know China, the world's second largest economy, has long been the engine of the global economy. According to the IMF, China is expected to grow 6.6% this year, up slightly from the previous estimate, and 6.2% in the year 2017's growth prospects have improved modestly because of multiple interest rate cuts, increased government spending, and stronger credit growth. That's, of course, according to the Chinese government. But what do you think, Professor Liu, the factor of the Chinese economy and its impact overall on the growth of the world?
I think now, to compare with the sluggish growth around the world, China is still a major contributor to shore up the economic recovery, although it is slow, and China is facing its own problem with the downward pressure. And in the meantime, China is also moving very steadfastly towards a more of an innovation-driven economy. We are going through a lot of painful structural changes, institutional reform, and anti-corruption going on. So now China is also ready to invest more around the globe, and by trial and error, and it's also a big learning process to have more of the global and social responsibility for Chinese companies. And now with the One Belt, One Road program, with the AIIB in place. So I think China is offering, number one, a showcase of pragmatic approach to solve global problem, to seek for tangible outcome. Number two is that China is a strong proponent for the free trade and also the reduction of investment barriers. So going for also for RMB liberalization. So I think China is on the right path.
They're on the right path, but how fast? That's probably one of the questions that needs to be discussed. And how much be able to go against the challenges while on the right path? That's also an issue. But let's go to you, Mr. Kennedy. The other two gentlemen were very modest in a way. They all talk about their own issues. What about issues of the United States? It is still the biggest economy in the world. It is having some problem with China, with the rise of China, geopolitically.
Yes.
And its standards these days might not be necessarily all accepted by others anymore. Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah. I think actually, broadly, thematically, there's a consensus amongst the G20 countries that we saw at the trade ministers meeting at the beginning of July, and the finance ministers meeting a couple weeks ago, and that we'll see in September, and that to get stronger global growth that's sustainable amongst wealthy countries and developing countries, you need to use fiscal measures, monetary measures, and engage in structural reform. The challenge, though, is that not every country can use the same tools because they have different fiscal situations, monetary situations, and debt is growing globally. And so that leaves structural reforms. The U.S. faces its own structural reforms that it needs to carry out. China does. These are the most difficult things because they create losers who need to be compensated in some way without expanding debts more and continuing to generate growth. China is struggling with its own supply side reform efforts. The U.S. is trying to adjust to globalization. We're seeing that reflected in our political campaigns this summer and into the fall.
Right.
Everyone wants to do something. Everyone knows what they need to do. But politically, they are super challenges, not just in China, but in the United States and other countries as well.
Mr. Kennedy, I really want to follow up on what you have just said. It is not just the United States which you see a very dramatic presidential campaign going on. Everybody knows that you don't have the best candidates for the president, at least besides the two party members. But one thing is very interesting. You see some very similar symptoms worldwide. You see political gridlock in Washington, D.C. You also see political gridlock worldwide. You see the rise of extreme politics, left or right, whether in the US or in Europe, and some of those countries, such as Japan, also in Asia as well. You also see moderate leaders, political leaders, being replaced by some extreme voices in political spectrum, and it's likely the latter that is winning so much popularity. So under these circumstances, the G20 summit, what can really the current political leaders do to make a change to the already existing problem? Political gridlock is the biggest thing that is hindering further policy alliance worldwide. Mr. Kennedy.
I think that's a very astute analysis, Tianwei, and I really wouldn't challenge it other than to say, I know things look gloomy on economic front and security front in a lot of different areas, but we don't want to overstate how difficult things are. The Asia Pacific is still growing relatively well. There's no wars ongoing, although there's possibilities for some conflicts. And the current leaders in the United States, in China, in Europe, still are committed to collaborating with each other. And I think we're going to see out of the G20 summit in Hangzhou, not major breakthroughs, but a series of incremental pieces of progress in a lot of different areas. It's not going to be something to say that everything has been solved, but we'll see. There'll be some measures on growth, on finance, investment, on currency that we can use to move forward. So I don't want to say that it's all gloom and doom and we ought to just turn out the lights, and there's still good reason to go to Hangzhou.
Oh, we love to turn on the lights, Mr. Kennedy, as long as we have enough power, of course. But Professor Liu, let me go to you. We love the list that Professor Kennedy gave. I have already noted them down. We'll see whether they're going to come true or not. But to you, there has been a lot of talk about emerging economies, developed economies have so-called stagnation, structural stagnation. That was the word used by Lawrence Summers, who is always very rhetorical and also outspoken. He talked about aging population. He talked about the very challenging structural reform. He also talked about the kinds of huge technological change in the world which make people to save more rather than to spend more because they don't know the future. That is not likely to change in a short period of time. So how much do you think the political leaders really have to work on it in order to make sure people understand change has to happen, and it has to happen also from their own little space as well?
I think number one, they need to inject more confidence into both investors and consumers by building more consensus, at least to identify a problem that the whole world is facing. And then they need also to find a strategic roadmap, which is really in the missing for the number of rounds for the G20, and then they set up specific goals. And so I think more practically, we really need to see more of the early harvest and picking the low-hanging fruits so that people can really feel the tangible benefit by believing and working together with the leaders.
Okay, you've already talked about 4 things. One is problems, roadmap, solutions, and early hanging fruit. 4 of them all together. Let me go to you, Mr. Cleppe. Will that happen? We understand that the political leaders, when they gather together, if they really need to have some kind of political achievements in order to report back home, they need to work very hard, and they have to work hard from now on almost. We see, Mr. Cleppe, earlier in the G20 finance ministers meeting, they come up with 10 huge pages of achievements, and it have 35, if I have it right, different kind of attachments to that document, and also 19 issues to work on, beautifully out there. And yet, really now we are talking about the top political leaders, whether they have the wisdom and the capability and the guts to do something. Mr. Cleppe.
Well, I think most developed countries need indeed to make a number of urgent reforms. One of the reasons why populists are becoming more popular across the Western world is because of the failure of the mainstream. The mainstream has been making all kinds of promises and hasn't done all that much, to be honest. If you only look at government spending, for example, it's going up for all the talk of austerity. The scope of the state is much bigger than it used to be. If you want to start a company, you're faced with bureaucracy, with high taxes. So this is of course not conducive to economic growth, and companies should be liberated. Back in the 80s, Thatcher and Reagan, they made a number of courageous reforms. Of course, there was a lot of opposition because there are always vested interests. But I think eventually, if countries want to create a lot of jobs, in order to sort of avoid that people start voting more and more for these populist parties, they will need to do what has worked in the past, which is to implement liberalization of the economy.
I see. Mr. Kennedy, how low can we fall in order to bounce back? At the G20 summit this time, how much do you think President Obama, which is already on his way to leave the White House, no matter what he has done over the past 8 years, would manage to do in collaboration with his Chinese counterpart, for example, the Chinese President Xi Jinping?
Well, I think, if you want to look at 3 areas where I think we could see some progress at the G20, take away your super long list and kind of boil it down, areas where the U.S. and China agree, and I think probably most of the G20 would agree, would be, first of all, on a real credible achievement would be recommitting to, at the earliest stages, arriving at an environmental goods agreement at the WTO. Those negotiations have stalled. They could decide that they'd want to achieve that an outcome by the end of this year. You could also see agreements on dealing with tax issues. I know that China anti-corruption is a big problem for the U.S. American companies going abroad to get tax breaks that seem unfair. There's common ground to deal with the global tax code. And you can also see some agreements related to international norms for transnational investment to make that investment easier, more predictable, more stable, to get national treatment wherever it needs to go. And so those would be 3 areas where I would look for progress in September. There's going to be a long list, but if you could get those 3 areas, I think that would be significant and noteworthy, even if still incremental.